Good afternoon. This is an informational hearing, so we don't have to wait for a quorum. Welcome to this oversight hearing of the Assembly Committee on Elections and Redistricting. Today's hearing focuses on the impacts of the top two primary and the SB 6 on election costs and administration. As we begin, I'd like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, I'd like to ask everyone to make sure all their cell phones, Blackberries, or pagers are silent or turned off. Second, if there's anyone in the audience who is not on today's agenda but who'd like to testify, please sign up with the Assembly Sergeant of Arms here in the front of the room, right there. We will take public testimony once we have heard from the speakers who are on the agenda. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to make a quick note about the terminology that I'll use during today's hearing. Although the primary election that we will be discussing often is referred to as an open primary, I will refer to the system as a top two primary, and the background materials that were prepared by the committee use that same term. We don't do this to be a contrarian, but rather because the term top two primary is more descriptive and more precise. While the term open primary can refer to a number of different election systems, the terminology top two primary refers uniquely to the type of primary election system that California will have if Proposition 14 is approved. As the members of this committee know, last February, as part of an agreement on a mid-year budget adjustments, the legislature approved SCA 4, which will appear on the ballot this June as Proposition 14. If voters approve Proposition 14, we will create a top two primary system that is similar to the primary election process used in Washington and Louisiana. Under the top two system, voters will be able to vote for any candidate for state or federal office in a primary election, regardless of partisan affiliation of the candidate or of the voter. The two candidates who receive the most votes in the primary election, regardless of party affiliation, will appear on the ballot at the subsequent general election. In some cases, it is possible that both candidates appearing on the ballot in the general election will have the same party preference. While many people are fairly familiar with those basics of the top two primary system, however, fewer people are aware of the additional changes to state law that will be triggered by Proposition 14 if it is approved. At the same time the legislature approved SCA 4, it also approved SB 6. That bill, which goes into effect if the voters approve Proposition 14, would amend, repeal, or add 63 different sections of state law, primarily in the Elections Code. Many of the changes in SB 6 are merely conforming changes that are necessary to provide for a top two primary election. For instance, proposed amendments to the election codes change existing state law to specify how the candidates who appear on the ballot in the general election would be determined. Other changes, however, are more substantive. For instance, SB 6 prohibits write-in votes from being counted at the general election for any office that is subject to the top two primary. SB 6 also makes changes to the way that Californians register to vote. I'm sure that most, if not all, the members of this committee have strong feelings one way or another about Proposition 14. But the purpose of today's hearing is not to hear arguments for or against the Top Two Primary Act or Proposition 14. I'm sure there'll be no shortage of opportunity to have those arguments in the 98 days remaining until June's election. Rather, today's hearing is designed to give the committee a chance to hear from election administrators, the county and state election officials who run state and federal elections in California. I decided to hold this hearing because county election officials provided information to the committee staff outlining some of the challenges that they may face in implementing SCA 4 and SB 6. I felt it was important for committee members to learn about those issues, especially since the county election officials have indicated in a letter to the committee that the top two primary and SB 6 could result in millions of dollars statewide in ballot production and postage costs. I want to make it clear that the elections officials that we will hear today are not taking a position on Proposition 14. In fact, they have made it very clear that they do not have a position on that measure and that they will dutifully implement Proposition 14 if approved by the voters. And I am confident from what I have seen during my short time as chair of this committee that these dedicated public servants will do so as efficiently and effectively as they can while complying with the requirements of SCA 4 and SB 6. I'd like to make one last clarification about today's agenda before we begin. It was reported in the Sacramento Bee's Capital Alert this morning that the proponents of Proposition 14 had requested to testify at this hearing and that the request was denied. I feel that I need to set the record straight at this point. The committee did not receive a request from the proponents of Prop 14 to testify at this hearing, so any claim that such a request was denied is erroneous. I want to thank everyone for coming today, and before we hear from the speakers on our agenda, I'd like to ask if our Vice Chair, Assemblymember Adams, would like to make any opening remarks. Assemblymember Adams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I again want to reiterate what the Chairman said. This hearing is not intended to be a determination of whether or not members of this committee or those who are testifying have a firm position one way or the other on Proposition 14, but rather an opportunity to hear about the administrative obstacles and hurdles that such passage would place on those folks who administer our elections. I think it's noteworthy, too, to point out that this is in no small measure necessitated by the fact that the way in which this measure was put on the ballot was done in a way that circumvented the committee process and didn't give committee the opportunity to have a chance to vet the bill, the proposal, and its innumerable consequences to the changes in the election code that would take place should it pass. I think it's specifically noteworthy that the costs in of themselves are so substantial that it would likely never have gotten through appropriations committees with the current levels that we have and the restrictions on state spending because of the fiscal crisis that we've been facing. And so it is with a great concern for the costs that are going to be incurred by the state of California throughout, not just at the statewide level, but at the county level, that I'm happy to be a part of this committee, and I'm thankful for the chairman calling it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Assemblymember Adams. With that, we will move on to the beginning of our agenda. The first item on our agenda is to hear about the potential impact of the top two primary and SB 6 on county elections officials. Joining us today, we have 4 county election officials here on behalf of the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials. Those 4 officials are Jill Levine, Registrar of Voters here in Sacramento County, Tim McNamara, Assistant Registrar Recorder, County Clerk for Election Services in Los Angeles County, Deborah Seiler, the Registrar of Voters in San Diego County, and Steve Weir, the County Recorder in Contra Costa County. Thank you all for joining us today. Yes, please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Chairman Fong and committee. I am Jill Levine. I'm the Registrar of Voters for Sacramento County, and I also sit on the legislative chair as a co-chair with Deborah Seiler. And, of course, my job as an election administrator, of course, is to follow the law. And so I do not take positions on anything, especially what's on the ballot. However, you have asked for some of the impacts that this SB 6, SCA 4, Prop 14 will have on the election officials. And I would say the devil's in the details here. We have 650,000 registered voters in Sacramento County. I use an optical scan ballot card, or cards, depending on the election. And I'm required to have all voting material in 2 different languages, English and Spanish. I put both languages on the same ballot card. And in November of 2008, I had 46% of my voters choosing to vote by mail. The voters that choose to go to their polling places put their ballots in a precinct scanner, and the results are uploaded on election night. And it's important to note these differences since not all counties have exactly the same voting system. They have different types and sizes of ballot cards. They have different language requirements. And some may choose to count their ballots centrally. All these differences make the implementation of SB 6 a little different and the cost different from county to county. So it's not possible to take my estimated cost and apply them statewide. Since I'm from Sacramento County, I have used the data from the June 2006 primary and with the help of my staff applied it to the requirements in SB 6 to see what this impact would be. A primary election in our county costs approximately $3 million. With the implementation of SB 6, I estimate it would cost our county an additional $1.1 million. Our biggest impact would be the ballot cards. In 2006, we had 2 ballot cards. And we would be increasing to 4 ballot cards in order to hold all the candidates and the requirements that is in SB 6. And, of course, the instruction language. The cost to print, the cost for postage, and the staff time to process these 2 additional cards is very large. And when we talk about processing the 2 additional ballot cards, we're talking about the inserting, extracting, the counting, the reconciliation, the duplicating, and all those other issues that happen with 2 extra cards. And, of course, we have to stay within the deadlines. Our sample ballot would also increase with the requirement of printing the list of voter-nominated candidates that party endorses. And then, of course, with that, the cost of printing and postage would increase. And with the change from voter registration party to preferences, our election management system would need to be changed. The change to voter-nominated candidates would involve changes to our candidate and campaign systems. Training would increase for our poll workers as they face the voters with all of these changes to their ballots. And all of these changes added together will take significant time to implement. If Prop 14 passes, we would like to work with some changes to make it successful for both us and the voter. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Tim McNamara from Los Angeles County. I'm a representative from Los Angeles County on the CACO Legislative Committee. I'm also the Assistant Registrar Recorder, County Clerk for the Election Services Bureau. Because of the added language language regarding candidate party affiliations or lack of added candidates and other language, Los Angeles County's 312 whole position vote recorders may exceed capacity, possibly causing it to not be able to accommodate all contests and or jurisdictions, or possibly making the system obsolete. We cannot add ballot cards, as you see in your packet, that some counties are able to do. Also, there are uncertainties regarding ballot and tally layout related to moving contests to non-traditional positions, related to candidate rotation, which also could call into question the ability of this system to continue to function optimally. We also believe poll workers would be challenged explaining the modified primary vis-a-vis the top 2 primary system, as well as explaining central committee contests for some candidates, and lack of traditional contestants on the November ballots. Also, there are some concerns regarding the change to decline to state voters and their registration systems that are tied to other components, as Ms. Levine alluded to.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Deborah Seiler. I am, as Jill mentioned, the co-chair of the California Association of Elections Officials Election Legislation Committee, and also the Registrar of Voters for the County of San Diego. It's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation. San Diego County currently has about 1.4 million registered voters. We provide ballot materials in 4 separate languages, 3 in addition to English, Spanish, Filipino, and Vietnamese. But unlike some of the other counties, and this is where we differ slightly in our approach, is that in our county we primarily have only 1 ballot in our elections. Typically that ballot will range from an 8.5 by 11 inch ballot to a 14-inch ballot to a 19-inch ballot. What we're looking at with the possible passage of Proposition 14 is that for the first time San Diego County would go to a 2-card and possibly even to a 3-card ballot. And in speaking on behalf of San Diego County in this instance, I'm also really speaking on behalf of those counties that use our same voting system. All of the counties that use our same ballot layout and tabulation system have been able to get their elections onto 1 ballot card. So let me just lay out a little bit the consequence of going to 2 ballot cards for us. First of all, we are a central scan ballot tabulation county. That means that we have about close to 1,700 voting precincts on election day in a large election. And on election night, all of those ballots come into our office centrally, where they're scanned by hand in our warehouse using optical scanners. We anticipate that with the addition of at least 1 extra ballot card, that we would probably add about 3 hours to our scanning. We would also probably have some slightly greater confusion in terms of our canvass reports, because no longer would we have a one-to-one relationship between the voters and the ballots cast. The way our system is laid out, we have the cards cast reported, and because we have one ballot for each voter, the number of voters equals the number of ballots cast. This is not a huge issue, but there would be some confusion as a result of that, and I wanted to point that out. Currently, we have about 40% of our electorate is signed up as permanent vote-by-mail voters, and in a large election, we do have more people going to the polls than vote-by-mail, but in a smaller, lower turnout election, such as a primary election, typically over half of our voters are voting by mail. We have looked at the costs, and of course, there's not, I don't think, a totally perfect way of estimating the exact impact, because so much depends on the number of local measures, and so much depends on the number of state measures that might be added to the ballot. But our best estimate is that we would add between 1 and 2 ballot cards, and that would add approximately $1 million, or about 75 cents per registered voter to our cost. Now, should Proposition 14 pass, we as Jill mentioned, would very much like to work with the legislature, because we do see some areas for potential mitigation of these costs. One example is the heading that is required in SB 6, that is in 24-point type with lots of language on it. Not to discount the importance of the wording on the ballot, but it's very, very large type and takes considerable space on the ballot. And also there is language indicating the party preference, and it reads, "My political party preference is the XYZ party." And when we lay this out on the ballots, it takes several extra spaces. So whereas we might be able to get by with 1 ballot or even 2 ballots, sometimes that stretches us into the 2nd or 3rd ballot. And those are some avenues for possible mitigation that we would like to explore with you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steve Weir from Contra Costa County, and I have with me today Candy Lopez, who has almost 4 decades of experience in running elections and has survived. For me, the issue is costs, and I want to thank the legislature for paying for past mandates. We sincerely appreciate that. We'll do whatever you and the voters say, but we would hope that you would pay any incremental cost, because for me, that's my main issue. I am not taking a position on Prop 14, but there's no doubt in my mind that there'll be significant additional costs if SB 6 is implemented because of Prop 14. I would like to just make a casual observation. I think anything that gives voters more choice is something that the voters want. And I can tell you that the primary election that we had in 1998, the blanket primary, by and large, was very popular with the voters. It was very popular with our poll workers. It was popular with my staff, and my printer thought that he had gone to heaven. With the top 2 primary, our general election ballot might be a bit shorter, and although that may not save us very much money, it certainly is an operational consideration. So there's a plus with that. If SB 6 requires a double ballot, and I am making the assumption that it would for Contra Costa, I would see a 10% increase in my printing costs and 10% in my operation, which for my county is $680,000. This does include some savings, by the way, because we'll be doing longer press runs. We will stop having small multiple ballot types and have longer press runs. So there is a slight advantage in this, and I factored that into my calculation. But I have to say, all bets are off if the legislature takes us away from the bifurcated presidential primary. Scheduled for February 7, 2012, we're now starting to think about it. Under SB 6 and Prop 14, the combined presidential primary, with a potential significant increase in decline to state voters, and the party's options to allow people to play partially or wholly within their primaries, could result in a ballot ordering nightmare, the likes of which would eclipse our February 5, 2008 experience. Some of you may recall there were counties that became very close to running out of ballots. We did quite well, but we were surprised by what had happened in that election. The same thing would actually be compounded if you combine SB 6 with a combined presidential primary and general election, or primary election, I'm sorry. I believe that some modifications, and you've heard those before, to the language requirements on the ballot could mitigate many of these consequences, and we feel that if willing, we would work with you on those mitigations which would eliminate some of the concerns that you've heard here today. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Do you have any questions?
Yes.
Sandre?
Mr. Chairman, I just noticed that we're talking about the additional costs, associated with the potential passing of Proposition 14, but we really haven't talked about why. I don't think that we've really given an explanation of Proposition 14 and why it would create these additional costs, and essentially because it would end up eliminating the way we currently do our voting by party nominating candidates and there being primaries to essentially, regardless of party, the top two vote getters would then run, and whoever they are, they end up running again in the fall. And so the cost that you're talking about has to do with changing our systems, I guess our computer systems, to be able to accommodate that change. And you haven't addressed the costs essentially involved in two candidates running twice for the same office, which is also an additional cost of this. But it appears to me that it may involve some software questions. And could you comment on that, and if there are potentially extensive costs involved in new software to address this new way of voting for Californians?
Assemblymember Swanson, speaking on behalf of San Diego for the moment, I don't think that for our county specifically that there would be additional software costs per se. Let me just sort of briefly kind of run down some of the costs that we see, that when I said that it would probably cost us $1 million or close to 75 cents a registered voter. Most of that cost, we pay currently 28 cents for every single ballot we provide. We provide these large optical scan ballots. They cost 28 cents. So the addition of those ballots is a major component. It's the largest component of the cost that we would incur. And then for all of those people who vote by mail, there would probably be an additional maybe up to 30 cents a registered voter for postage. So those are the two probably largest components. But the other types of costs we would have, if we added 3 hours, for example, to our election night count, that we have about 200 people working in our warehouse just to count ballots. So that would be a cost of approximately $12,000 right there. We would have to add more ballot cartons to bring those in, possibly extra collection centers. We would have more trucks to make deliveries. So these are all, again, things that flow from the addition of that extra 1 or 2 ballot cards for us. Other counties have a little different situation.
For us, it's the cost of the second and third ballot card. My costs go up to $436,000 just for 2 more cards. And that just kind of snowballs, because if you have more cards, now I need more people to extract them from the envelopes, lay them flat, and then run them through the ballot counter. My ballot counters start like a week before the election, and they go pretty constant because they have to count so many ballots with all their vote by mail. If I had this many, if I had double the cards, I'm going to have to either do night shifts in order to complete them by the deadline, or I'm going to have to buy more ballot counters. So I'm a central counter for absentee, or vote by mail. That extra cost of processing, the inserting of the second ballot, the bigger envelope, the postage, the extracting, the laying flat, the extra temp help. And as they come in, there's always a mistake. Voters are wonderful, but they still say, oops, made a mistake, so we need to duplicate or remake the ballot. Well, you have to remake the entire ballot, and so the whole thing has to be done. So instead of 2 cards, it's 4 cards we're remaking for every time. And it will be, well, I mean, not every time, but it will increase the cost of just, it just kind of snowballs into a big big cost. So the processing of these extra ballot cards is one of our biggest costs. For software changes, there will be some software changes, but our vendor, according to our contract, is licensed to as business as usual. So if this passes, he will be making those. But also the time it will take, I don't know. It may take, will we be done in time? Because this goes into effect in January of 2011. And if a special election is called, will we be ready? And that's a good question. Will all the changes be made by then?
And you and all of you, the counties would expect the state to help pay for these additional costs.
Yes.
So if Proposition 14 passes, the state, even given our current financial crisis, could expect to have to pay tens of millions of dollars more to accommodate this new law. Is that right?
Correct. And I think Tim has a question on software. His is the biggest software question here.
I think I'd address your question maybe in two parts. One is I think there's various voting systems throughout the state, and I think the end implementation on the software is a little unknown. It may not be dramatic in some systems, but the worst case for our system in LA County, since we have a very unique system that can't add ballot cards like the other counties do, it has a capacity of 12 pages. We could get to a point where we would exceed those 12 pages. The system is not viable after that, or we have to start rejecting candidates or contests from getting on that ballot.
Yeah, and one more question. So the way this would work is that if Proposition 14 passed, you would no longer have a Democratic primary, and you would no longer have a Republican primary or a peace and freedom primary. So the Democratic primary, Republican primary, and all the other third-party primaries would be eliminated, and candidates would simply be listed on the ballot, and the top two of any party would then run again in the fall election, right?
The difference being the presidential primary would still be a partisan, as would Central Committee, which are the local offices. Those would have to be handled as a partisan primary.
Right. And so here again, Mr. Chairman, I think that this is very instructive in terms of the costs involved in the passage of Proposition 14 to the state. I think it certainly is it's probably in the category of unintended consequence of the state having to be responsible for millions and millions of more dollars. And I hope that we also address the question of what it means to the whole, essentially running the same two top finishers again in a fall campaign. The question on turnout in some states that have tried this, that they've had a record of lower turnout. Do you have any information on that? For instance, if the top two vote getters are Republicans, why would the Democrats show up at the polls? Is there any or vice versa? If the top two finishers are Democrats, because more Democrats in that district, why would a Republican bother to show up and go vote? And do you have any statistics on that or any experience from?
I think that is really going to depend on each election of who's running, and it's really be hard to predict at this time.
Yeah.
I have no comment.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, Anthony Adams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just two questions for you. Help me understand, please, the manner in which this is really going to be that extreme and the readjustment in light of the fact that, and pardon my naivety if this is not the case, but each of your counties does, in fact, conduct Board of Supervisor races that are run precisely along the same lines, where you have innumerable candidates of multiple parties all running on the same primary ballot, and your top two vote getters go on to your general. So if you're doing that successfully already for Board of Supervisor races, why is this so significantly different?
I think that's absolutely correct, that we're doing this in many cases for the nonpartisan offices. However, all that we're looking at is just taking, in our case, what we did is we took the June 2006 ballot and we said, okay, all of the candidates who are running from all of the parties will now be running on one ballot. So really what we were doing is we were saying we had in June of 2006, we had several different ballot types for various parties, but they were shorter ballots, and now we take all of those candidates and put them on a single ballot. So it just elongates that race. So that's really the major difference that we could detect, was there so many more candidates running for a particular office.
Does anyone else want to add anything, or does that suffice?
Well, except there's now additional verbiage that chews up really valuable ballot real estate. When you combine those two things, I'm convinced that we'd be forced to another card, and there's a known consequence for me.
Mr. Ware, I have a second question, and I think it's mostly directed at you, since you made the comment that sort of spurred this question in my mind, and that is the degree to which your increased primary costs may be offset by your decreased general election costs. It seems to me that you are going to have a smaller run in your general election as a function of the passage of of Prop 14. Can you talk to me a little bit about the numbers involved and how much, and I realize this is somewhat speculative, about how much you think you may save as an offset to what you're going to spend in addition during your primary?
For the primary, I think that there is a slight savings, and for me it's about 20%.
Primary or general?
For the primary, because instead of doing 224 different ballot types, I'm doing 26 ballot types. My printer is doing longer runs. There is a small economy there. That was included in the savings. The savings was discounted from the $680,000 cost impact I'd have from a primary. In a general, we can have 11, 14, 17, or 19-inch ballot. It would downsize probably one size. What does that mean? 2 folds instead of 3, a little bit less cost, but I actually couldn't quantify that right now. There's no doubt in my mind it would be a minor offset against my really known $680,000 cost.
I appreciate your question or your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, my question followed the same thing, whether you had done an analysis, given that you would have a shorter ballot in the general election than the primary election. But you've answered that appropriately. Thank you. I think you ought to keep looking at that as this thing moves forward. See if there might be any other ways that might offset the cost in the general versus the primary election. But thank you very much.
This is Los Angeles. If Los Angeles cannot accommodate the requirements of SB6, how much would it cost to acquire a system that could comply with SB6?
Well, I think the cost for replacing a voting system and a full-blown replacement of a voting system in a county, for example, like San Diego, was well over approaching $30 million, so you could multiply that by 4, I suppose, but I'm not sure those models fit Los Angeles. So it's an unknown, but it's well over $50 million to replace the voting system, given the model of voting systems that are out there right now. But we're not sure any of those voting systems can accommodate, off-the-shelf voting systems can accommodate Los Angeles needs anyway. So it really is an unknown.
Wow. And how would we pay for that?
In part, there are some funds left over from Prop 41 and HAVA, but even if there was a substantial amount of money, the challenge here is the timeline. We could have an election as early as January of 2011, and I don't foresee that we could replace our voting system by then.
Sandre?
Yes, and I appreciate the fact that you all were not taking a position on Proposition 14. You were simply saying that it's going to cost us more money, and that is, in my opinion, a reason why people should vote against it. And I also think that there are many more issues that are not issues that we've asked you to comment on, that simply address the whole democratic process in the state of California that I think the voters are going to have to address. So I hope that at some point we have a hearing where we talk specifically about those substantive issues which is the reason I didn't support this when it came before the Assembly. But thank you for your clarification on the costs questions. I think they were very enlightening.
Any more questions from Assembly members? I have a question on the return by mail voters. In Sacramento County, you have 4 of these?
We have 4. Well, right now we have 2 cards. They're
2
printed
cards.
2 sides.
And how much would that be additional postage for the other 2?
About 30 cents per ballot.
How much is it currently?
Pardon?
How much is it currently?
For if it's first class, see, when we do as much as possible with the nonprofit status, but it could be up to, like, it's currently 44 cents first class, so it would be up to 74 cents going out. If it's with a nonprofit, we can get it much lower, and those costs were reflected in my postage costs, that how many we mail out nonprofit versus first class. But you're going to also remember that the voter is going to be mailing them back.
Right.
And we'll need your phone numbers to direct those costs.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Just kidding. So.
Well, thank you very much. You know, we had a similar open primary due to Prop 198 in the 98 and 2000. How did you handle it back then?
I actually have a sample ballot from 1998, and at that point we were on close to the same system that Los Angeles was on, the 312 positions on a small punch card. And my sample ballot shows that we went to 273 positions, so we just barely made it on that card.
San Diego was also what they call the Votomatic county. That was the old Votomatic system, and the Votomatic system was able to handle it at that point, so we did not have to go to an extra ballot card.
The Votomatic could handle it, but this was from a Votomatic system in Los Angeles. The end of the ballot capacity is at page 12, and as you can see, we got to page 12, and I think you did as well. So the added text and the ballot designations really would challenge the 12th page.
Great, thank you.
Just if I could, that 1998 blanket primary is appreciably different than the thing we're facing today. It was much easier for us to administer, and the cost consequences weren't anywhere near the cost consequence of this one.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. Yes. Yes, Lori Sedona.
I do have a question regarding the requirement that the Secretary of State's office, and actually we probably need to wait for Rhonda Pascal to do that, but it could happen at the county level as well, that you have an increased outreach and information campaign. I think it's one thing to come from Secretary of State, but similar to the additional costs, where do you think the money would come from at the county level to provide additional information and deal with the calls and handle the confusion that may occur? Where do you see these potential staff and other resources coming from?
Well, as we interpret SB 6, there is a state-mandated cost reimbursement in SB 6. So we would try to, as best we could, capture those costs and then provide a bill to the state. But otherwise, it would go to the county general fund.
So you would be anticipating that the state could reimburse you since this is a state-mandated cost for you? Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Okay, next on the agenda, we have Rhonda Pascal on behalf of the Secretary of State to discuss the impacts on the Secretary of State's office. Rhonda?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. Rhonda Pascal on behalf of Secretary of State Deborah Bowen. If I could just say from the outset that Secretary does not have a position on Proposition 14, nor did she take a position on the provisions of SB 6. However, I'm happy to provide the committee with changes that would be implemented by the Secretary of State's office if, in fact, Proposition 14 is approved by the voters, as well as any fiscal impacts. So in addition to some of the obvious changes in our certification process, which would move the top two candidates that receive the most votes from the primary election to the general election, our office would be required to redesign the voter registration card and include specific language and formatting as required by the provisions of SB 6. Most notably will be the inclusion of the no party preference language, listing that at the beginning of the qualified political parties. The redesign of the card will be conducted in-house with staff at the Secretary of State's office, and there is language specifically in SB 6 that allows us to exhaust our existing supply of voter registration cards prior to printing new cards. So as a result, we don't anticipate a significant fiscal impact to make this change because we will begin printing the new cards as the existing supply of cards is diminished. In addition, our office will be required to make conforming changes to various candidate forms and instructions. As a routine matter, the Secretary of State's staff does make changes to various forms to conform with changes in the law. This would be no different in that respect, and so while there would be a bit of a workload issue from the staff's perspective, we don't anticipate a significant fiscal impact to implement those changes. Additionally, there is information that would be required to be printed in the voter information guide relating to the electoral procedure that is outlined in SB 6. We anticipate that this would add an additional one page to be included in the voter information guide. We format our voter information guide in 16-page increments, and very often we have blank pages then that would be available for the inclusion of this specific information. However, in the very rare instance where we didn't have any blank pages available, which our office really doesn't have a great deal of control over, it depends on the number of measures, on the length of the analysis. If there are bond measures included, we also are required to include information that the LAO provides us with respect to the state's bond indebtedness, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it would be a rare instance, I think, where we wouldn't have any blank pages available, but it is a possibility. The cost per page for the voter information guide will vary from election to election depending on the printing costs as well as postage costs that we incur at that particular time. Based on the last statewide election, we were in the ballpark of about $70,000 per page for the voter information guide. So if, in fact, we found ourselves in a situation where we did not have any blank pages available in the voter information guide and needed to add 16 pages in order to accommodate the provisions of SB 6, you would be looking at a potential additional cost of about $1.1 million if we were basing it on the average cost per page at the most recent election. The same language that is to be included in the voter information guide is also to be printed on posters or notices that the elections officials will post both inside and outside of the polling locations. Our office frequently makes various publications available on our website that could be printed by the county or by members of the public to use. And whether our office prints those posters or notices or whether the counties do that, there will be a cost either at the state or county level. And I think as you had heard from previous testimony from the county elections officials, if it's a state mandate, I think eventually it would be coming back to the state. When we last printed the Voter Bill of Rights as was required by HAVA, the cost to the Secretary of State's office at that time was approximately $15,000. Additionally, and this gets to the question that you had posed earlier, Assemblymember Saldana, there is a requirement that the Secretary of State conduct a voter education campaign. However, it specifically requires that we do so within existing resources. And this is to educate the public regarding the roles of the parties in primary elections for partisan offices, voter-nominated offices, and nonpartisan offices. Because our office is required to do this within existing resources, we will post information on our website. We'll include information in the voter information guide. We will update brochures and pamphlets that are produced by our office, as well as work with counties, businesses, and other nonprofit organizations that we already partner with in voter education and outreach efforts. There will be some computer programming required to our CalVoter 2 system to accommodate reporting election results as required by the provisions of SB 6. We're estimating about 110 to 120 hours by our vendor to make those modifications, and estimating that to be a cost of about $15,000. Our website will need to be updated with various information and instructions to conform to all of the requirements of SB 6. Again, this is a workload issue for our staff, but our IT staff routinely updates our elections website for every election, and we don't anticipate this situation being vastly different. However, in addition to just the normal information, et cetera, we are required to post on the Secretary of State's website the candidate's party preference for the past 10 years. This will be, I think, logistically one of the more difficult tasks for us to accomplish for this reason. VoteCal, which will be our new HAVA-compliant statewide voter database, will have the ability to capture that information. So once VoteCal is implemented and once it's been operational for a period of 10 years, that information, that history of the candidate's party preference will be available with the Secretary of State's office. VoteCal will also have the capability to obtain whatever information is in the current CalVoter system. And so to the extent that CalVoter has a complete 10-year history for that candidate, we'll be able to obtain that information pretty readily. The problem will be that if that candidate within that 10-year period has moved from one county to another, or if they've moved to California from out of state, in which case CalVoter may not have that 10-year history. Under the current system in CalVoter, if a voter moves from County A to County B, what happens is then the information from County A, that record would be deleted from the CalVoter system. And so absent us going out and contacting 57 counties to obtain that 10-year history, which doesn't seem very practical, we're considering updating our forms in a way that would require the candidate to provide us with other information with respect to other counties that they have been registered and their party preference, so that we would have the ability to contact the counties and work with them to verify that information. We will have a very narrow window of time to complete the verification of that information, probably about 5 days between the filing deadline and the time by which that we need to post that information on our website. It's difficult for us to quantify the cost to the Secretary of State's office to complete that process, because there are so many different variables, the number of candidates, again, the timing of when the candidates file. We'll obviously be doing the verification as they're filed, but the more candidates that we have filing late in the process could lead to a vast amount of information that would need to be verified in a pretty narrow window of time. Obviously, our office will be making every effort to verify that information to the best of our ability, but one of the benefits of transparency is that when we have that information posted on the website, we'll have numerous fact checkers, as that information will be available to the public at large. And finally, our office does not anticipate the need to recertify any of the voting systems in order to comply with Proposition 14. I know that there are some potential questions and concerns by the counties, and certainly if there are questions or concerns that counties have, we invite them to talk to our voting system staff or with their vendors so that we can, try to assess that and deal with that as needed. But our voting system staff believe that we will not need to actually recertify any of the systems in order to accommodate this. And with that, Mr. Chair and members, that concludes my comments. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Pascal, a couple of questions for you, and then I have a general comment for the committee as well. The first is concerning the amount of staffing that currently exists at the Secretary of State's office. A lot of what you spoke to seemed to imply increased workload. I'm wondering, to what degree do you foresee having to bring on additional staff in order to accommodate the provisions of Prop 14?
Not sure that we will have the ability to bring on additional staff.
As a function of need or as a function of resources?
Resources.
Okay.
As I know that you and I have had a discussion previously, we have about 30 permanent staff in our elections division, and which is pretty amazing what they're able to do on a regular basis. So I don't think we anticipate that we'll have the resources available to bring on additional staff, and obviously we will do everything with our ability to get everything done that we need to do.
That's a major concern to me, Mr. Chairman, especially in light of the fact that I agree with Ms. Pascal. I think their staff does remarkable work with an obscenely small amount of staff resources, and I'd hate to see them further belabored. I also want to talk a little about the comment about the recertification. Mm-hmm. One of the implications, not a full-on statement, but the implications that was made by the gentleman from LA County was that if the system should in fact go in place, or excuse me, the proposition should pass, that there was at least an outside possibility they would have to review and end up purchasing a new voting system to accommodate their needs. So at least with respect to LA County, would that require the recertification of LA County's voting systems?
Well, to the extent that LA County were to purchase a system that had not previously gone through certification by the Secretary of State's office, that would require a review and certification.
Which did seem to be the case in light of the fact that the gentleman's comments stated as much, that there was not a current off-the-shelf system that they had, so it would likely result in the creation of a new system.
That very well could be the case. Again, I think I'd like our voting system staff to talk with the appropriate folks at LA County. Again, their feeling was that that LA system actually could accommodate this. And not to say that there aren't challenges. I don't want to diminish that in any respect. And that there would not be the need to actually recertify the current system, and obviously any new system we would be taking a look at.
I appreciate that. That's of concern as well to me, Mr. Chairman, in light of the fact that I do think the recertification process is timely and it's expensive, and I would hate to see another county have to go through that to accommodate this. Finally, my last point is just for the committee, and I wanted to reiterate the point that Ms. Saldana made, because I think it's a tantamount concern to this committee. If, in fact, Prop 14 were to pass, there is a tremendous amount of need to educate the public as to what those provisions entail. To have the public at large not be aware that, for instance, you can currently vote as a declined to stay voter in either a primary for a Republican or a Democrat. Most voters don't even know that option exists, even though that's currently the law in most instances. I think voters tend to be woefully unaware of the options they already have at their disposal, and it seems to me that it would be almost irresponsible to see Prop 14 passed and not engage in some kind of public information campaign to make voters aware of that. And I have to point out Ms. Saldana's point again, that that's going to involve incredible costs to the state of California as we try to make people aware of that new privilege, that new right.
Thank you. And that leads me into a question about the voter education campaign, about the Top 2 Primary Act using existing resources. I assume that the Secretary of State would roll this in with existing voter education efforts. Is that correct?
Correct.
If so, what are some of those efforts that you can currently take, and how extensive are they?
Sure, and again, the language in SB 6 specifically requires that we do so with existing resources. So while we could probably launch a really wonderful voter education campaign with unlimited resources. That's just not a luxury that we have available to us. So again, in addition to information that we include in the voter information guide, we have pamphlets produced by our office that could be updated to include this information. We work with a number of organizations, League of Women Voters, just one example, in producing the Smart Voter Guide, so we would work with them to include that kind of information there. We have a Democracy at Work project where we partner with a number of businesses in doing voter education and outreach, and we provide them with sample messages, nonpartisan messages that they could include in their various publications or on their website. We also have a button that they can install on their website that can provide a link to the Secretary of State's website that would provide that additional information. Those are all the kinds of things that we would try to do, again, within our existing resources, in particular partnering with other organizations and really try to leverage those relationships in order to get the word out as much as possible to voters.
Okay, thank you. Assemblymember
Yes,
Cotto?
I just had one question. I remember 2-3 years ago I met with the secretary to talk with her about voter registration and the importance of this, the Secretary of State's office being more proactive and more aggressive in that area. And she said that just since the time that she had been elected, that the size of the voter registration staff had increased threefold, right, by 3 times more, and that you had gone from one person to now 3 people.
That is correct.
Now,
That's still current.
That's still current. Assuming that this passes, then that would that this legislation would pass. Would it not ongoing programs like voter registration be impacted by the need to redirect staff towards this new initiative, or have you thought that through yet?
Well, again, we will do our best with the resources that we have. We would just see this as, one additional duty that our staff already has. But our staff is already, because we have such limited resources, working very hard to develop those partnerships and relationships with other entities. And so this would be one other piece of information that we would be passing along in the hopes that our partners would assist us in getting that information out to voters.
Thank you.
Okay. Assemblymember Saldana?
I guess the way to rephrase what Mr. Cotto and Mr. Adams just brought up is, what won't you do as a result of needing to do this? But it's a very serious question, because we're living at a time when many people are questioning, what am I getting from my government? And I don't want to pay more taxes. And yet we're putting something before them that I hope this hearing will make clear there is a definite cost involved. And you're already operating very efficiently with a relatively small staff. And yet the question that I think you need to look at, and maybe you could provide information to the committee after this, is prioritize realistically, should this occur, what will you not do? And so it might be good to have that preemptively so people get a sense, just whether it's voter registration, whether it's other services that people have come to rely on your office to provide, and realistically say this would be on the chopping block if we need to redirect resources, because as it's very clear, you have to use existing resources, and that means that other things are on the chopping block. So have you done, or could you do, an analysis to advise us on what would likely be a priority-based spectrum of what items would not continue?
Well, certainly, and I think as we had initially taken a look at this measure, we thought that there might be additional cost to the Secretary of State's office. But again, there is so much language in the measure that allows us, for example, with the voter registration cards, to exhaust the existing supplies. For the voter education piece, to do this within existing resources. There are some other costs there, $15,000 here, $15,000 there, which I don't want to diminish, because as we take a 10% cut and likely facing additional cuts, all of that adds up. However, not nearly as significant as the kinds of costs that I think the counties would be facing due to the fact of the ballots and how those ballots are laid out and additional
And the
costs.
state will have to cut other areas to reimburse the counties unless, I think Ms. Seiler said, unless they pick it up from their general funds. But
Understood. I just want to make clear that from the Secretary of State's perspective, we will be complying with every aspect of the law, including this measure, should it become law.
thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Well, there's one obvious way not to expose the state to all these expenses, and that is for the voters not to approve Prop 14.
You are correct.
Oh, okay. Let me ask you. There's no disagreement in the Secretary of State's office on the statement made by the counties that there are unfunded mandates here, and that the counties will certainly present the state with a big bill after they attempt to comply with this law, if in fact it's passed. There's no disagreement with that, right?
I certainly don't speak for the counties, but I believe them when they suggest that they would do exactly that.
I think they'll give us a bill for it. And let me ask you, and the only thing about this hearing that can be of some concern is that here again, we haven't really explained Proposition 14 in detail, but I wanted to ask you, as I understand it, the congressional races also would fall under Prop 14 if passed. So that would mean that voters that are used to going to the polls and voting for their congressperson and looking for the Democratic ballot would not get a Democratic ballot.
That's correct.
Those looking for the Republican nominee for Congress wouldn't get that either. They would get one ballot with a bunch of names on it.
Correct.
Now, are the candidates do they have an option to not list their party or list their party under this proposition?
Correct. Under the provisions of SB 6, they would have the option of indicating that their party preference is, and then, ABC party. Or they could not
Right.
list that.
So they could. So for voters that are used to going to the polls and voting in their primary and looking for the candidate that's a member of their party, they may find a number of candidates who elected not to list their party.
Correct.
Which could also be confusing for some voters that are used to that system, and that speaks to the challenge that you were talking about in terms of the education
Correct.
of voters. Is that right?
Correct. And then again, I think as you heard from some of the previous witnesses, we then also have the situation with the presidential primary, which would be essentially conducted in the same fashion it is now. So in that case, there would be party ballots available.
So if Proposition 14 passed, so you would go during a presidential election, you'd go and you would get your Democratic ballot for president.
Correct.
Right. But for the members of Congress, you'd get a separate ballot that included Democrats, Republicans, and everyone else.
Correct.
I see. And so this question of additional, you said that the Secretary of State did take a position on initiatives, and I respect that. Does the Secretary of Office have a comment about whether or not, just in terms of candidates running for these offices, and the top two candidates during the June election being the same top two candidates that are on the November election, any statement about the additional costs to electioneering in the state that would involve running essentially two full-blown campaigns with the same people? That seems to potentially will cost the system of campaigning a lot of money.
It very well may. Again, that's not something that our office would be commenting on, but
Sure.
I'm sure there are probably other folks out there that might be able to provide you with that information.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, and you've helped me explain why I voted against this measure.
You're welcome.
Are there any more questions from the Assembly members? Not? Thank you very much, Ms. Pascal.
Thank
you,
you.
Rhonda. At this point, we'd like to move on to the public testimony. I'd like to limit your comments to 3 minutes each, not 2, but you get 3 minutes, and because we have some time. The first speaker is Deborah Rager, or Rager? Rager?
Do I sit there?
Yes, please.
You might want to announce the next couple of people so they can start coming.
Okay. Laura Wells is on the deck, and Richard Winger after Laura Wells. Okay, Deborah?
Hello, I'm Deborah Rieger. I'm the North State Chairperson of Peace and Freedom Party. I'm also a candidate for State Treasurer. I want to thank you for having this hearing today. I think it's important to examine the dollar costs, but I also think it's important to talk about the social costs. I'll make my comments quick because I realize you're looking for dollar costs. There is a huge social cost to this, in my opinion, and that cost is that we all believe in a democracy in this country. We think democracy is good. There are 6 ballot qualified parties in California, not just mine, not just Republicans and Democrats, but we believe in and support the whole range. It's hard for new parties to get ballot qualified, but some of us are already on the ballot. This is going to disenfranchise the democracy that the third parties have enjoyed for these years, because you will sometimes see 2 Republicans on the November ballot, sometimes 2 Democrats on the November ballot in places that are heavily districted for Democrats or for Republicans. But right now you will see a Libertarian and a Green Party and an American Independent and a Peace and Freedom Party member for governor. But we will never see it again if Prop 14 passes. And it may be true that those people rarely get elected to office, to an assembly seat or something like that, but it's a very important part of our democracy that this is available. And so cost, yes, I think this is a cost, not a dollar cost, but a really horrible, horrible social cost of taking democracy away from voters in California. I'd like to also note that in the state of Washington, where on a dollar cost basis, where a similar measure has passed, they're tied up in legal challenges that are very costly to people on both sides. I'd like to encourage you to ask your staff to follow the dollars on this ballot measure and find out who is putting the money into the pro-Prop 14 stuff. It's not people looking for democracy. It's people looking to do corporate control of voters, and it's manipulative, and I look forward to the hearings in which we talk about the democracy issues of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I ask one question, just very brief? So do you anticipate, because this Proposition 14, if passed, would essentially destroy the third-party system,
yes,
as we know it, and would you anticipate it would also hurt in terms of voter interest and turnout in the fall election if there's no choice, essentially?
Yes, I do think so. If you consider a place that you know is, for example, a very Democrat district, we already look at when someone's elected, and it will always be a Democrat seat or always a Republican seat. The other big party will always go ahead and cast votes, but eventually, why will the Republicans even bother voting in a Democrat seat that will always be Democrat? Because there'll be 2 Democrats. Yeah, I think it will lessen enthusiasm for people of all parties, especially in the districts that are already set aside for certain parties, because you can just flip a coin and let any Democrat win or any Republican win. And if you're not a member of that privileged party, whichever one it is in your district, it doesn't matter, because whoever wins will not be representing you. Just like Republicans and Democrats maybe don't represent the Libertarians that live in their district, although I believe they try to. I believe they try to represent me as a Peace and Freedom Party person. But pretty soon we're going to take away everybody's stake in the outcome of our democracy, and I think the democracy is what we need to really protect. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comments. people may know by history that the seat I represent, the 16th Assembly District seat, at one point was represented by a Green Party member of this House. And so, democracy can work.
Yeah.
If you give it a
won't
chance.
happen again if
Yeah.
this passes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Laura Wells.
Hello. Thanks for having this hearing. My name is Laura Wells, and I'm a candidate for the Green Party nomination for governor. There are direct costs and indirect costs, and the direct costs are significant, the ones that we've been talking about today, which are the costs of printing the ballots and so on. But there are also indirect costs to a method like this, and that has to do with the fact that California then puts itself in the position of having to pay back the corporate campaign contributions. And I should actually call them the corporate investments in our political system, because in their rush to exercise their right to expensive speech, they call it free speech, but they are making investments. And let me give you an example. Enron is probably the best known example of where the corporation came in, gave contributions to both sides of the aisle, and got enacted in legislation the electricity deregulation. What happened next was that they raided essentially the budget of California. They attacked not only the California state budget, but the budgets of all of the voters of California, and made a huge difference in what our budget was. Now, the top two parties that would win in this kind of a method would very likely be the corporate funded parties, not the third parties. And so that kind of corporate costs to California would continue, and we would like that to stop. I'll say one other thing, that the opportunity costs in terms of candidates. I'll preface this by saying that white men are wonderful. White people are wonderful, men are wonderful. But so are the rest of us. And what happens when I ran for state controller in 2002 and in 2006? In 2002, out of the 7 statewide offices, there were 0 women that ran in the Democratic Party, 0 women that ran in the Republican Party. In 2006, it was infinitely better because there was 1 woman. 1 out of the 14 Democrats and Republicans that ran was a woman, and that's Deborah Bowen, who is now the Secretary of State. In 2010, I'm not sure yet what the situation will be, but it's gradually getting better, and part of that is, I think, because there have been third parties, and that is where the diversity of this nation has started to run as candidates, and then later the big parties began to pick it up. So that's something that the opportunity, not only for candidates to run, but people actually like to vote for a diversity of people. And so what we would like to do is to continue allowing the diversity of parties, of political beliefs, and of candidates to be on the general ballot in November, not just in the primary ballot. And so let's reduce our costs to the California budget and
Thank you.
not have
Thank you, Laura.
top 2.
Thank you, Laura Wells. Richard Winger, and on deck is C.T. Weber, Gary Bryant, and Janine English. Richard Winger. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, for this hearing. I will talk about costs to the taxpayers. There are not just costs to the taxpayers from election administration. There are costs when the state is sued. Washington State has been in constant litigation for 10 years over its primary election system. the press of California has not done a good job of explaining what happened in March 2008 when the U.S. Supreme Court heard the Top 2 case. There are 4 bases for a legal attack on the Top 2 system. All the Supreme Court did in March 2008 was settle one of them. There are still 3 other avenues of attack going on. Now, this handout is from the Washington State Secretary of State's webpage, and it lists all the litigation history of the litigation by the political parties against Top 2. Half the entries on that handout, you'll see, have come since the U.S. Supreme Court decision. Furthermore, the parties haven't even filed their briefs yet in the U.S. District Court. There's going to be a trial in October 2010, and I will just take another minute to say I'm going to assert that this case has a 50-50 chance of going either way. And now you may not believe me, so I'm going to give you a fact that will support that. I acknowledge that the PPIC report said the constitutionality of Top 2 is assured. But the author of that, Dr. Eric McGee, told me he did not do a legal analysis. He's a political scientist. And my evidence that this case is really could go either way is the way the Washington State Legislature has behaved this year. They need to fix up the loose ends of Top 2, and the Secretary of State put in a bill, Senate Bill 5987, to fix them. And they didn't pass it. The reason they didn't pass it is they think this case could go either way. Why should we waste our time and energy fixing up a system that may be thrown out? And I'll just take another 10 seconds to tell you the biggest loose end they have. The Washington State Republican Party and the Washington State Democratic Party are going to cease to be qualified parties on November 2nd, 2010. That's not a controversial statement. Everybody knows it up there. And yet they still didn't pass this bill, which would have fixed it. The reason they're going off the ballot is a party in Washington State is defined as a group that got 5% of the vote for any statewide race in the last election. But the Democratic Party is not going to get 5% of the vote for its nominee in 2010, nor is the Republican, because parties don't have nominees anymore. So they have a problem. It's a little embarrassing. Of course, they can fix it. They're going to fix it by transferring the vote test so it only applies to president. But the very fact that they wouldn't pass this bill this year tells me they really don't know which way this case is going. So California is going to be all tied up in litigation if this thing passes too.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Any questions? No? None? Okay, thank you. C.T. Weber, Gary Bryant, and Janine English. You can all come up. First, C.T. Weber. C.T. Weber.
Yes, my name is C.T. Weber. I am the Peace and Freedom Party candidate for Lieutenant Governor. I'm also the Sacramento County Chair of Peace and Freedom Party. You know, I'm kind of harsh on the electoral system as it is. I think the elections, because of the way the districts are gerrymandered, are basically rigged, I call it. I really prefer systems more like they do have in most democracies around the world, using proportional representation and so forth. I do want to speak to this here, and that is that the fallacy of this is that it limits choices in the general elections. And some people even say that it's not a primary. Some people say it's just like another general election, because not only does the state have to pay for the additional costs, but the candidates themselves not only have to campaign just to their party constituency, but now they have to try to approach the whole electorate. And that's both winning and losing candidates. So all candidates are going to have to spend more money, as well as the election officials. The cost, for example, the Secretary of State says we're going to do everything we can. However, one of the things in most government offices is that they have a number of employees who are represented employees. In other words, a labor union represents them. If they try to pull more work out of them, to work longer hours or whatever without any more pay, in fact, we're getting pay cut now, you know, it's not going to fly. So you're going to have resistance from the the unions inside the different functioning offices. So one thing that I want you to think about, though, is that this will limit choice. There will be no more third parties on the November ballot. There will be no independent candidates because the way they qualify now is they gather their signatures between the primary and the general election, and it's only going to be the top two. Write-in candidates will not be allowed. So, you know, you're only going to have two candidates, and as we've talked before, it could be either two Democrats, meaning Republicans won't have a choice in that particular general election, or vice versa. So I think it has a lot of problems, both as far as social costs and economic costs. And the primary cost is going to go up both for the government officials running the election as well as the candidates themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, CT. Gary Bryant.
Hear me? Okay. I'm running. I'm from the Libertarian Party. I'm running for 3rd District State Assembly. My biggest concern is about the constitutionality of it. When voting is a First Amendment right, people are expressing their freedom of speech. And by cutting off third parties, which I thank all of them for speaking up, I am in total agreement with them, and I really thank Mr. Swanson, I wish he was here, for what he's been saying, because this gives people no choice. And I think there could be a lot of other ways of cutting costs, because we are broke, we are bankrupt. That's a fact, $20 billion in the hole. And I just think it will be disenchanting for voters who want to express themselves, because had this law been passed when Minnesota happened with the governorship, Jesse Ventura would not have been able to say, I'd like to thank all those who threw their vote away from me. And that's what I think all of us would like, to have that pleasure someday. Thank you.
Thank you. Janine English.
Hi, I'm Janine English, State President of AARP. We are supportive of Proposition 14. We've endorsed Proposition 14. We believe that this gives voters more of choice. And in addition, we believe that based on the California Senate analysis, there will be no fiscal impact. Based on the legislative analyst analysis, there will be no fiscal impact. We also believe that voters need to be educated, and one of the commitments that AARP has with our members and other citizens is to continue the education process, as we have done with the redistricting campaign. Again, we think that it allows for, currently we have voters that are disenfranchised. When we had the 1998 blanket open primary, 53% of the registered voters voted. Now it's down to 28% and decreasing. We have people that are not participating in this process. We need to open the process and make sure that all registered voters and all citizens of the state can participate, and we think that the open primary is one effort to do that. So we're supportive of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Janine. That finishes our testimony. Are there any other comments from Assemblymember? Yeah, Assemblymember Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. A couple of things I wanted to point out. First of all, notwithstanding the fact that the Proposition 14 before us is going to involve a number of substantive changes to our election codes, certainly going to cost our counties and our state increased dollars, and create some modicum of voter confusion. I do want to be clear about one thing, and that is Californians are sick and tired, I mean absolutely disgusted with the system by which they feel like they have no legitimate input in it, and the hyperpartisanship has gotten so out of control that they're not adequately represented. So make no mistake about it, notwithstanding my concerns about Prop 14, my no vote against it on the floor of the Assembly last year, or the fact that the voters are going to have an opportunity to hear it this year, if this isn't the right model, that's fine, and I'm perfectly happy to reject it along with my colleagues that voted against it. But at the same time, I think there's a wake-up call that needs to occur here. Californians want to see the hyperpartisanship eliminated from Sacramento and to see us actually get to work. And I'm remiss to berate Prop 14's attempt to at least do that, and it is disconcerting to say the least that we are going to dismiss the clear intent of what voters want us to do because the vehicle by which they've adopted, or at least have an opportunity to adopt, is certainly got room for improvement. Number two, The elimination of the primary general system as we know it today, I don't know if it necessarily does disenfranchise voters. Frankly, from my perspective, if you have two Democrats running in a general election, they're likely to split the vote amongst the Democrats, meaning the other parties, the Republicans, the Peace and Freedoms, the Libertarians, are going to have a disproportionate impact on who gets elected to that office, and those two, in this hypothetical, two Democratic candidates are going to have to work very hard to appeal to a much broader base than just their core constituencies. And I think that's precisely the point. I think that's a good thing, and I don't see it as disenfranchising voters at all. And finally, I have to take issue with the incredibly vitriolic and demagogued concerns raised about corporate control. Corporate control, money and politics will always go hand in hand. The degree to which corporations participate is no different than the individual, which is no different than the labor union, which is no different than any interested party. The idea that corporations are somehow evil and intrinsically bad and everyone else gets a pass because they're not self-interested in the outcome of elections, I think is intrinsically disingenuous. And I just think I wanted to make those points known. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Assemblymember Adams. Well, you heard the impacts of the top two primary, SB 6, Election Costs and Administration. Thank you very much for attending this hearing. Thank you. And the meeting is adjourned.